Hi, this is Paul. I probably would have liked this video to be longer than it's going to be, but I have about an hour to record it. And so these 2 weeks, that basically are the school Christmas vacation. So my wife's off work. We've got family coming in and out. I have extra services to do. Never quite have as much time to do other things in these 2 weeks because at the same time I have at least as much work to do, if not a little bit more. And I want to take as much time as I can to be with my now young adult children who are in and out of the house this time of year. So that's sort of the way this goes. I would have liked to have played clips and everything for this video, but I don't think I'm going to have the chance. But so what is my channel? Well, my channel is sort of, at least the monologue videos are what I'm thinking about for the last couple of days. And I just preached a sermon on the Jordan Hall common stuff, which I thought maybe I'd make a video of today, but then decided this one is more what I want to do. This is the line between Christians and atheists. In the video I just did last week, commentary video on Tom Holland's interview, which I thought was really incredible. He talks about he doesn't believe in a God. Now again, pay attention to the details of that. He doesn't believe in a God, or doesn't believe in God as such, the way Christians do. Someone on Twitter just pointed me to Unsafe, so the Unsafe channel. I was on with them a little bit ago. Carrie Smith and I forget the other guy's name. It's not there on the screen. They had James Lindsay on with a group of people for their own little Christmas party. And, there was a really interesting piece that starts about an hour, 4 minutes in and goes for about 10 minutes, where James Lindsay talks about his evolving relationship with Christianity and Christians, and where he remains an atheist, but he has a lot of respect for them and really says quite a few pretty dramatic things. And maybe a little later on this week, I'll have a little bit more time I'd probably like to do a little bit of commenting right on that little clip, because it's really an outstanding little clip. Very interesting. And so this is just such an interesting time where we find atheists, people who have identified as atheists or even continue to identify as atheists from whatever background, increasingly cozy and familiar with Christians. And well, they might wind up in church now and then. They might even actively go to church and continue to consider themselves atheists for one reason or another. Well, here they are. And, they're, maybe at points a little embarrassed to try to explain it, but not embarrassed enough to avoid Christians or stay out of church or do anything like that. So what on earth is going on? And of course, in the little corner of the internet that I've been working, we've got a number of you who are in that category, and we've got Christians who are sort of deconstructing but reconstructing into other things, maybe other denominations, or not reconstructing at all. But it's a very messy little estuary we've got going here right now. So this sort of brought me back to the firing line, the big daddy of all this, who kind of kicked off this. Didn't kick off the whole movement, of course, because that had been happening without him, but became sort of the flare in the movement, which was, of course, Jordan Peterson and his peculiar answer to the question of whether or not he believed in God. And that, in some ways, was sort of the vestige of sort of Cold War language, because you have these people over here who believe in God and these people who don't, and then you could make assumptions and expectations with respect to them. And that whole thing seems to be breaking down. What do we or they mean by believe, and what do we or they mean by God seems to be much more important questions than how they answer whether or not they believe in God. And of course, what was one of the most fun moments was the Rationality Rules moment, where he discovers that Jonathan Peugeot is a real Christian. It's like discovering Santa Claus. And there it was, because you're not one of those people who actually believe in a God. Yeah, I do, as a matter of fact. And so what is that super thing that they have difficulty believing in? And quite likely Tom Holland and James Lindsay are in exactly the same boat. That, well, what's their conceptualization of God, and what's the conceptualization of belief? That, God is somehow a super thing, and the world is made up of mindless matter, and physical laws just are. And that's just the way the world is. And I just saw a video creep across my algorithm feed to the effect of, physicists trying to get back to the steady state universe, because they would just somehow feel a lot more comfortable if you could undermine the Big Bang or get in front of it. And of course, this is tremendously ironic given all of the time that many of us have seen Christians try to undermine the Big Bang. Well, what was going on in that fight? Well, what was going on in that fight was really a fight over intentionality. And for many Christians, they just be against the Big Bang, but what they were really for was intentionality. But they didn't have that language, that a little bit more precise, perhaps esoteric, abstracted language. They just sort of knew where the tribal lines were and who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. And we see a lot of that going on, but it's really breaking down. And the same has to do with the presumed definition of the word religion. That religion is what people do when they imagine a super being or super beings who hear your prayers. And this was very easy to discount via the culture as childish wishful thinking. But we're finding that entire line of argumentation sort of sported out by the new atheists around the time of the, little after 9/11, we just find that sort of falling away as not really a serious way to address what's actually going on beneath the surface. I'd really love to, I've got time. I can do this. Hang on. Now, I haven't checked the sound or anything, so it may go disastrously wrong, but Michael and Nate and Julian did a conversation on Randos United on radical orthodoxy. Now, no, for a lot of you, you're going to hear that and think, well, that's just a whole bunch of Christians talking, and they are a whole bunch of Christians talking, but these are some really thoughtful Christians that are, have been on my channel and are on the Discord server and are really wonderful conversation partners, because they're just having thoughtful, open, honest, very smart conversations about, well, how can we talk about reality? And Michael here, who's been on my channel a number of times and has been on the Meaning Code channel a number of times, Michael is just such a wonderful conversation partner, and so such a clear thinker, and so just such a wonderful guy. And here he talks a little bit about reflecting back on his deconstruction and his reconstruction. Let's see if the sound levels are okay. Nope. Hang on. I got to fix that. Let's see. Let's put it here. Okay, let's try again.
Yeah, because what it's conceiving of essentially is this underlying unity within all the distinctions we're making, which to me makes a lot of sense. Like it just if these things were as disconnected as we sometimes presuppose in the modern vision, like it would be folly to me to, and that's one of the reasons when I deconstructed away from faith, I could never embrace any sort of, even though I lived in a materialist culture, I could never really embrace materialism because it just didn't make sense in so many.
And I really like this because if you go back to my first conversation with him, he grew up in sort of a Pentecostal situation and just sort of wasn't buying it, and deconstructed and left the faith and left the church, and now is of course clawing his way back and figuring it out and putting it together, and as many people sort of grew up in a Christian bubble in a far bigger materialist world. And so first was sort of enamored by the materialist world, and let's see if I can just flip back there. I mentioned here in this slide Dallas Willard's The Nature and Necessity of Worldviews by the Veritas Forum. I played that in a number of my videos a couple of years ago, because Dallas Willard basically makes the point that a lot of the worldview deconstruction and reconstruction is happening at a very subtle level, usually of social status. And, well, it's people, the world sort of appeals to pride. Well, you're not one of those people who believes these things, are you? And then, deep inside, your elephant thinks, I'm going to lose herd status if I don't keep up with the herd and believe what everybody else believes. And of course, the PR agent on the elephant's back starts making up language, and we got another one deconstructed. Oh, we got another one who's not going to church. Oh, we got, and the clapping gods all cheer. But Michael here is sort of thinking about his, the first draft worldview. What do I mean by first draft worldview? We all absorb and inherit these ideas, and so, and our absorption is rather indiscriminate. And what we do over time is we try and piece these things together. And when we're in our child, when we're children, we sort of mirror our parents. As we grow a little older, we start mirroring other lights and peers and teachers and thinkers, and we just keep processing these things. And then the older we get, the more that we process, and the more that we see, and the more that we try to produce in our minds this map which is coherent. And well, I think map is the right metaphor, because we have this little tiny internal map that sort of tries to relate to the bigger world out there, and that's our worldview. But the world is big and complex, and there's a lot of things going on.
Levels, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, you end up deconstructing. The logic of modernity leads to postmodernity, which deconstructs logic itself, right? I mean, it all starts falling apart very quickly, and there's enough sense, there's enough beauty, there's enough something within this world that as long as you have a little bit of gratitude and humility, I think you have to, if you're honest, ask some serious questions about where that comes from.
Right. And I would say, and the only thing I would like to add to that is and that the entire project begins out of a desire to create a space away from God. So of course that's where it ends up.
Now, a space away from God. Now, just pause and pay attention to that thinking. Now, this is very Christian language, but pay attention to the spatiality of it. Now, again, if you would press, Nate is around the Discord server and in the channel comments a lot, and nobody's going to not recognize how sharp this guy is and how well read he is. You don't have to just look at the books in his background here. You can just read his comments. And why does he use this language of space away from God? Isn't that language just sort of bought into the space-time three-dimensionality modernist world? Well, in some ways it is, but also the pre-modern and the ancient world uses the same. And, well, why do we use this? Now, again, some smart cognitive scientist might come around and say, well, exaptation. Of course we're using metaphor from our daily lives to try to address supersensory things. We don't have any other language. And this is a huge point that C.S. Lewis makes in his book Miracles and his chapter on horrid red things. This is a huge point that we have to contend with, but it's one that isn't. And so smart atheists who are listening to this just begin to scoff because, well, isn't every place space around God? But then again, if you've been immersed in Christian theology, especially if you grew up in it, there's these weird little questions that arise when you're growing up as a Christian. And, a bunch of them are the village atheist questions like, who did Cain marry? Did Cain marry his sister? And, all these kinds of questions. But if you get into other questions, if you were raised or catechized by Christianity and someone says, well, God is everywhere. Well, then when Jesus came, God came down to earth. You say, wait a minute, I thought he was already here. Well, he was. Well, what do you mean? How can Jesus be God? And if God is everywhere, then you begin to notice that if you try to push this kind of language beyond what its user intends, the analogies just break down. And of course, that's not unusual with analogy or metaphor. They all break down because we're just trying to compare two things, and we're trying to extract a little something in particular from the thing. We're trying to extract a relationship, a relevantly realized relationship, in order to get at what exactly are we talking about, and where are we going with this?
Like, it's like, so that and it gave us a lot of power to act within the world.
Do you think modernity began with that motivation?
And now, even with this little conversation here, well, how could modernity have a motivation? You're talking as if it's a person. Yeah, we're always talking as if it's a person. Well, why would we do that? Because again, part of what happens in modernity is that there are no people beyond us, no people above us. But now modernity has a motivation. Well, Paul, you're just pushing the metaphor until it breaks. Yeah, I am. You see my point about metaphor? We all do it. We can't help but do it. It's just part of the way we use language.
I think it began with a motivation to, like, no, I don't think that it did not begin without a motivation. I think it was like sort of it was definitely an accident. I don't think that you can. I think that it definitely came from a motivation to, like, to gain power over the natural world. I would say that's fair. See, I think it began in theology with the desire to understand God.
And of course, these two aren't exclusive. Do we want to gain power over the natural world? Yeah, the natural world is scary and brutal, red in tooth and claw, and it takes us out all the time. So let's gain power over this virus and get some vaccines out, and whatever, or the flood, or sunscreen, but then now Michael's point is also critically important.
And make his transcendent nature more explicitly understood. That's definitely true, and that's definitely where radical orthodoxy places the roots of it, is definitely in, like, that post Aquinas scholasticism, for sure. Yeah. But that goes alongside with that you can't separate that from the early impulse toward doing natural science too, though, because those things were linked. I mean, they weren't just doing theology. So I think that so what you're saying is definitely true, but I think it's also linked to this, like, desire to gain dominion over nature too, in addition to, like, trying to maybe an impulse to understand God in a way that puts God within human control. So they're both sent in both.
That's our oldest impulse.
They're both linked to an impulse.
And what on earth do we mean by God? And how far away is God from nature in that? And I mean, it just continues to proliferate
toward human domination and control, which is why they go astray ultimately. And I'm not saying that they were necessarily consciously, like, conceived in that way, but there is that underlying sense of that.
Okay, I have a question.
Julie's going to take him off in another direction, but love what they're doing. And so, I love that little bit of conversation, because there's in some ways the 11th century to the 21st century, just a tiny little slice of it, abstracted, made into tiny little metaphors. Whoosh! It's right there in some ways. But so let's get back to the question. Well, how are we managing this? Well, we're holding these worldviews. What do I mean holding? I'm using we're grasping, okay? And if you can't watch John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis without understanding the exaptation and the grasping and all of that language, and we've got parabolic thinking. I think about Mary Cohen's idea of parabolic thinking. We've got all these tiny little parables. And we've got this we've got common sense here. Well, what is common sense? All these little, a stitch in time saves 9, and we just have this tiny little story and this thing that, especially in in Benjamin Franklin's days, something that would be very obvious and deep to everyone in the village. And then we'll bring in Neil Postman, in some ways like Jordan Peterson, where this whole channel began. Neil Postman, and you would have this, you'd say this little parable, and well, then everybody in the town would say, yes, that's right. And that's how parables worked, because the parable basically carried the argument, and everybody understood the parable to be true. And once you connected the in real life story to the parable, everyone would just agree. And of course, we're bumping into that with, all of the drama around the election in the United States. Was the election free and fair? And Eric Weinstein, in his latest Portal, doesn't interview anyone, but Eric reads a couple of his little essays that he wrote, and they're very interesting essays. He makes an argument that the election was not free and fair, but for none of the reasons that a lot of people are arguing. It wasn't free or fair. It wasn't that there was massive voter fraud. It was, and then Eric looks at much more structural issues. And of course, it's Eric Weinstein, so it's very smart and rather esoteric, and it's very Eric Weinstein-like. But what are we doing here? We're trying to get a handle on this world, which, again, I've made the point that even the little world that is in my little messy office at the corner of Florin Road in Sacramento, California, is way too complex for my little brain to handle. Now, I've got it fairly well mapped, and I've got the books well mapped, and my office is quite well mapped in my mind. And even in the messiness, if I need something, I think in the midst of the messiness, sort of exactly where to go. There's a member of my church that's the retired chief hydrologist of the state of California, and his office in downtown was legendary because there were just these stacks of loose leaf paper all over the room, and people would come in and they'd ask him for something. He'd make kind of a funny face, and he'd look at one of those particular piles, and would go down just so far and sort of pull the paper out of it. I mean, we have astounding mapping capacities, and that's what we're trying to do in this. So now, again, I'm pointing to, I think, a critical chapter in C.S. Lewis's Miracles, Horrid Red Things. You can find different versions of this in other places. The C.S. Lewis doodles. One of the things that Lewis quite obviously did, if you read a book like Miracles, is that many of the chapters in the book were essays that wound their ways out into other publications, and they were often tailored a little bit and a little bit different in terms of the introduction and stuff. But in this chapter, he makes the point, well, the whole chapter comes from a little girl talking about poison, because in her mind, she imagined what poison is it has horrid red things in it. And, she had some experience where she had connected poison with horrid red things. And Lewis makes the point that poison and her picture in her mind of horrid red things really doesn't have a lot of basis in what we might look at as scientific truth. But if you were to go into her house and ask her what's poison, the little girl would likely be a very good guide. If you'd go to her house and you'd start eating something, and if the little girl would say, don't eat that, that's poison, well, you'd probably better listen to the little girl. Because even though her idea of horrid red things might not relate to what a chemist would look at as poison, it's a low resolution enough picture, and her picture of her home is probably good enough, yet those things come together and provide a livable, now we're sort of into Jordan Peterson pragmatism to a degree, a livable way to live in the home. And now it would be sort of the really smart 12-year-old atheist that would maybe look at a bottle of rat poison and it's all white powder, and the little girl would say, don't eat that, it's full of horrid red things. And the little smart atheist would say, it is not, and go on to eat the rat poison. The fideist might believe the little girl and say, well, I'm a little doubtful about the horrid red things, but she is a, and you see this in the Chronicles of Narnia, in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Lucy goes through the wardrobe, and of course nobody believes her. And of course, the professor says, well, do you know your sister to be a liar? Well, no. Edmund's much more of a liar than Lucy. Well, why don't you believe Lucy rather than Edmund? That kind of knowledge is actually really important. And so the atheist, the smart 14-year-old atheist who chows down on the rat powder, is going to die because he wouldn't listen to the little girl that had some picture thinking about horrid red things. Because this is sort of the way we work with how do we hold our worldviews. We tend to hold them in pictures which are exapted from the world around us. And C.S. Lewis makes that point in that chapter about thrones and ascension. And of course, this is all of the sort of questions that drew me to C.S. Lewis's book Miracles and drew me to Jordan Peterson, because we have these two worlds that are divorced. And I still am not terribly clear, but wasn't clear when I started this on, okay, what exactly are these worlds and how are they mapped and how do we put them together? So we use images of sorts and metaphors that are made from the sensory world. Via exaptation, we extrapolate into the supersensory. This is where John Vervaeke, in my conversation with J.P. Marceau, talked about hyper things, and that sent Paul and Leitner off to make a podcast. And you can find he did a podcast on hyper things, which I thought was really very helpful. And so, but it's very interesting that the people who named it hyper things, we still got more exaptation. We can't seem to get around these things. Well, why? Why are we so hung up on particles? Well, I think it's because particles are sort of like physical things that we can grasp and we can hold and we can manipulate. We're just so good at grasping and holding and manipulating, creating things like straws, where I can, suck my iced tea up out of the bottom and bring it into my mouth to refresh and sustain me. This is what we're good at. This is why we love particles, and this is why these certain images remain with us and why we like them so much. Now, so lately I've been doing a lot of thinking about Descartes and substance dualism, and God bless YouTube for all sorts of really interesting videos that I can just grab onto and learn about it. And so here, Qualia Soup, what a name for a YouTube channel, 154,000 subs. Philosophy YouTube must be loving some Qualia Soup as a video about substance dualism. And now part of what I think late modern naturalism or materialism or physicalism really attempts to address is this sort of the pickle that Descartes put us into with his two substances. Well, what on earth does he mean by two substances? Well, and this is where I think a lot of atheism sort of defaults to is, well, how can we have one world that makes sense all the way up? That's sort of what we're trying to do, and that's sort of what Jordan Peterson is trying to do, and that's why images of Tower of Babel sort of come to mind. We're looking for a physical substance that can go all the way up and all the way down, and so Cartesian dualism sort of had two substances. You had physical substances, and so those are things which, now this is where we sort of get into my group A and my group B. Physical substances are these substances in the physical world, and physical is really the most important world there, physical substances. Then we have, and this guy says, abnormal physical substances. For Descartes, it was much more mind, and so that's where you had the mind-body problem in Cartesian dualism. Now, physical substance, matter of the world, and this, we sort of grasp this stuff. We have a story that we believe with respect to how the world auto-arranged itself into being, into the kind of world we find today, including us. And now what's so amazing is that this story is taken on faith. Pull someone from the street who's an ardent anti-theist atheist and say, well, it's all been explained how we got here today by, and then the big E word comes in, by evolution. Evolution explains it. And then you've got a really inconvenient guy like James Tour. He's fun to watch. I crack up every time I watch the guy because, you know, he's one of these dreaded evangelical Christians who at the same time is a world-class scientist in some of the really important science, and he just basically calls bullshit on a bunch of this stuff and says, hey, I know the biochemistry. You tell me how life comes, how organic matter gets started from inorganic. You show me that line. You show that process. You build a laboratory and you do it, but no cheating. And so James Tour he's got his own YouTube channel now. He's not necessarily the greatest interviewer in there, but neither is Jordan Peterson. You get interviewed by Jordan Peterson, might as well be a monologue video half the time. But James Tour, I mean, if you listen to some of his other lectures, I mean, he's just basically saying, you know, show me the math. You don't have it. I know you don't have it. I can't do it either. And I'm smarter than you. That's basically what he keeps saying. And people sort of just kind of blow him off and walk away. But this shows that, you know, faith in evolution is just as much faith as faith in anything else. Well, why? Well, we believe in these processes. Well, have you seen them with your own eyes? And maybe you say you've done them all, and I would have to believe you because I'm not about to, because I don't have, you know, 30 years of my life or 40 or 50 or 60 years of my life to develop the scientific expertise to personally retrace the steps. We have to take it on authority. And again, this isn't an anti-evolution screed, you know, that's not where I'm at on my channel. I remember when I had an early conversation with Adam Friended, he asked me, do you believe in evolution? It was kind of like, do you believe in God? It's basically the questions are parallel. And I said, I don't really know enough science to answer that question. I'll say, I believe the world is a product of processes. What does that mean? Well, the world is a product of processes. Well, how are those processes? I haven't had a biology class since high school, and that was at Christian school, so you're going to have to give me a break. And if you say, well, Vander Clay, you should go back and get some more biology. It's like, hey, I'm in my late 50s. I only got so many years on this earth left, and as much fun as it would be, I doubt I'll be doing it taking college biology. All right? So I'm going to have to take things on faith by listening to credible people, and that's why I'm not a particular skeptic in evolution, but I'm not a particular proponent of it either. I just don't know enough about it. And then someone will say, oh, you should talk to, yeah. If you saw the number of people that, Paul, can we really have a conversation? Yeah, I got to just kind of fit it into all the rest of the conversations. I would love to. And, you know, basically, when I see you in the age to come, when we've been there 10,000 years bright, shining as the sun, we've no less days to have a conversation than when we first begun. So, no, but I want it now. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. It's, you know, join the rest of us in time, space who have limited resources. So, anyway, back to the conversation. Substance dualism, that's a real issue, and that's sort of where a lot of my thinking has gone, and partly because of the Vervaeke J.P. Marceau conversation, because John Vervaeke made this point about directions. Well, how do thoughts move my hands? And are my thoughts really sort of subject to the same physical laws? And if they are, what does that mean about rationality, about moving my hands? And some of you would say, you have no rationality about moving your hands or your lips. And I would laugh at that because I generally probably agree with you more than I should. So, and then I found this delightful video by Sally Latham, who I don't know what's going on, if she's a college professor or if she's a TA, but she's got all these little videos answering questions about philosophy. And I don't know, she really seemed to do a good job. Do I have time to play this? Hey, it's my channel. I'll play it if I want to. Let's see how it goes.
Your method of doubt. And in that method of doubt, he doubts everything he possibly can, which includes his body. Up until that point,
she's talking about Descartes here.
He had believed that it was his body that was certain. He said that, okay, it's my mind that's uncertain. My mind is like some kind of wind, flame or vapor. I don't really know what it is. I don't know how to explain it. But bodies, I know about them. I can see them. I can touch them. They're the things that are certain. But the method of doubt flips it. So the method of doubt means that the body is uncertain, Because of the evil demon, even because of the dreaming argument, he can doubt his body. But he can't doubt his mind, the cogito. So that positive solution to the method of doubt is the idea that the mind is easier to know than the body. It's the mind that's certain and the body that's uncertain. So what he used to think was essential were bodily functions. You know, I have to eat, I have to sleep, I have to breathe. If I don't, I'll cease to exist. But now he sees these things as not essential. So the body is not essential to him, whereas the mind is. If he ceased to think, he would cease to exist. So we have this flipping of what's important and what's essential, which is quite important to understand. The other thing that's really important to understand is what a substance is. So substance dualism, proposed by Plato, proposed by Descartes, proposed by Richard Swinburne, is the idea that the...
Her volume's a little low, so just trying to raise it, but I can't do that. I don't have time to raise it, so I'll just play this now because she's just getting to the meaty part right here.
Mind is proposed by Descartes, proposed by Richard Swinburne, is the idea that the mind is an ontologically distinct substance. So the mind is not reducible to the body or any part of it. It exists as a substance in its own right. So to understand what a substance is the bearer of properties. It can survive a change in those properties, but it itself does not need those properties to exist. So if you think about the difference between substance and property, red is a property. It has to be attached to a substance, and it cannot exist without that substance. So if you try to conceive of red independently of any other thing, you can't do it. For example, like round, you have to have a round something. It can't exist in its own sense. So roundness is a property, not a substance. So what we're going to get to with substance dualism is the idea that mind is this ontologically distinct substance. It can exist independently, and it doesn't need, it's a bearer of properties, but it's not itself a property. So for Descartes, for Plato, for Swinburne, you've got the thinker, which is the substance, and the thoughts, which are the properties. So the thinker is the permanent thing, and the thoughts change. They come and they go, and the thinker owns these properties, which are the thoughts, and can survive a change in them. You know, our thoughts are changing all the time, and yet it is something that survives all of that. I won't be discussing Plato here because obviously it's just purely Descartes. Richard Swinburne's worth a look if you have the time. Shameless plug here, but if you want to read about Richard Swinburne's substance dualism, check out my article in Philosophy Now, Swinburne's Separations. You can just go online and get that as one of your 4 free articles a month, I think. Ridiculously complicated. I don't think I understand it anymore. But substance dualism it's hugely unpopular now in academic philosophy. So I think, according to Richard Swinburne, about 1%, 2% of academic philosophers are substance dualists. But I guarantee that at some point, you've probably thought like a substance dualist. So if you believe that the mind could survive bodily death, that there was something that was not reducible to your body, so when a loved one or a pet ceased to physically exist, if you believe they carried on somehow, then you were thinking like a substance dualist, that the mind can exist independently of the body and is a substance in its own right. So what we've got with these separate substances is Descartes says the mind is a thinking, unextended substance. It takes up no space. It's not made of matter. Whereas the body is brute. It's not intelligent. So if something's a brute, we tend to think of it as unintelligent, just kind of passive and physical. And bodies take up space, so they're extended and they're made of matter. And they're also, the bodies are divisible and the mind is indivisible, which will become important shortly. So that's known as Descartes' real distinction between mind and body. And he's a radical substance dualist. So the mind can exist completely independently of the body. He's also an interactionist. So mind and body have this two-way interaction. Mental events affect physical affects mental. That is the issues with interaction, I think, deserve a separate video. If you were to need that, just pop it in the comments and I'll just see what I can do. But for now, what I want to focus on are the arguments for why the mind is this separate substance.
Okay, and she goes on from there. So it was a very informative video. I thought it was very well done. Now, she'll go on to say in that video, and as many other videos on YouTube will go on to tell you about, there's all sorts of trouble that arises with this Cartesian substance dualism. A lot of skepticism about this non-physical substance, about this mind. And even though we all experience mind, we experience consciousness, and mind and consciousness and soul, they're not all the same thing, but it's all out there, and to have this just sort of floating out there is problematic. And this is where the substance dualism from Qualia Soup gets really interesting, because if you listen to his complaints about this, they're all wielding complaints, and they're all complaints about us. And well, we have problems with this basically because we can't account for it, we can't seem to control it, and partly because I think, and he doesn't go into this, but we're looking at it with the scientific image, and most of these things are all manifest image type issues, and so the troubles just proliferate. Now, I think if you look at what Michael was saying in the Randos video, and when I think about my conversations with many who have deconstructed, the issues basically go around, well, I can't believe Christianity because of, in some ways, Christianity has become this separate substance, that spiritual, like, so it sort of goes like this when you begin to read the Bible as someone immersed in the materialist, a physicalist world, that, well, angels, well, what are angels? Well, are angels made of anything? No, they're spirit. Okay. And I think what sort of pops up in our mind is this, a dualism of sorts that I don't think completely maps onto Descartes' dualism, but it definitely is a dualism, because then we have physical things, and you hear this all the time in church. I mean, so many of my observations just come from doing basic church work and listening to answers in Sunday school or just from church members. Now, I think a lot of these answers weren't talked to people, but again, we live in the midst of this world, and we construct this map, this first draft map in our minds. And so then it's, well, there's physical things and there are spiritual things. And so then the question is, what's the relationship between these physical things and these spiritual things? Well, I don't know, but there's two of them. There's physical things and there's spiritual things. And so spiritual things are better. And it's like, Gnosticism is haunting us. What is the relationship between the physical and the spiritual? And, when I get into school spirit and a lot of the conversations about spiritual things on my channel, a big part of my agenda is, well, let's up the resolution on this a little bit. Let's see if we can talk a little bit more intelligently about the relationship between spirit and matter. And of course, if you go into Plato, into Aristotle, into Descartes, and many different places. I also watched a good video by Jordan B. Cooper. And Jordan B. Cooper, I notice his name comes up now and then. And at some point, I subscribed to his channel, but I hadn't watched any of his videos, or at least not many of his videos. He seems to be a Christian, maybe of Lutheran background. Just my Protestant spidey senses listening to him says, well, you sound, get some Lutheranism going on there. But talking about, had a really good video on substance dualism and laid some of that out. Love to play it too if I didn't have just 17 minutes until a family phone call. So I got to keep moving. Where was I? Oh yeah. Spiritual versus material. And I get that answer so often. And part of the problem is in church, once you say these things, everyone just nods their head and says, yes, that's so say we all. And it's like, okay, so say we all, but what do y'all mean by that which you think you have just so said it? And so that's where I always annoy people in Sunday school class. One of my church members, she's actually a deacon, she's a very, very devoted church member. She says, I understood this Bible passage until I came to Sunday school, and you made it all muddy for me. I thought, yeah, I did, didn't I? Because you thought you understood it by reading the New Living Translation, and all that did was serve you up some pre-chewed baby food, and I'm not the baby food kind of, spooning pastor you're looking for. And I'd have a bigger church and a bigger YouTube channel if I were, because I want to know, well, what do you mean when you say that word spiritual? And for that matter, what do you mean when you say the word matter? Because the particulate stuff is going away, boys and girls, and I know we like it because we can grasp it, but we got a meaning crisis here. So back to horrid red things, and a really important passage in Lewis's Miracles in Horrid Red Things, when he talks about this literal versus metaphorical, which is getting at spiritual versus material as well. But of course, the exaptation which we are using in our minds is all in this too, because it's in our minds we have this mapping, which is of course a mental mapping of the physical world, but a mental mapping of the spiritual world via the physical. That's what we're doing when we're mapping this stuff. And so here's the quote. Mr. Barfield has shown, as regards to the history of language, that words did not start by referring merely to physical objects and then get extended by metaphor to refer to emotions, mental states, and the like. Now, again, if you're a modernist, you simply presume that that would have been the process by which this would have happened. But no, nobody, 5,000 years ago, you didn't find any modernists. Everyone was doing this to the best of our knowledge. Why? And Barfield, of course, was the guy who exposed this and said, hey, if you read these things, how sure are you when you read Plato that you really know what he's talking about? Or the Bible? And of course, for Protestants, that really scares us. So Mr. Barfield has shown, as regards to the history of language, that words did not start by referring merely to physical objects and then get extended to metaphor to refer to emotions, mental states, and the like. On the contrary, what we now call the literal and metaphorical meanings have both been engaged. And again, watch any celebrity video who is trying to do an anti-theist job against Christianity, and you will find that little word literal used again and again and again and again. And they simply don't take this paragraph into account. And they don't take this reality into account. And ancient people were not literalists. That's the problem. Does it mean that they didn't report what they saw? No, they reported what they saw. And the reports got carried down through and all of those things too. But they were not literalists. They weren't metaphoricalists, because the distinction wasn't quite clear then. In the same way, it is quite erroneous to think that man started with a material God or heaven and gradually spiritualized them. He could not have started with something material, for the material as we understand it comes to be realized only by contrast to the immaterial. And the two sides of the contrast grow at the same speed. Now that's critical there, because what emerges is a duality that comes to us over time. Now I know some of you think, Luke, that all dualities are evil. Well, dualities are not necessarily evil. Some dualities are very helpful if you want to do some things. We started with something which was neither and both. As long as we are trying to read back into that ancient unity, either the one or the other of the two opposites, which have since been analyzed out of it, we shall misread all early literature and ignore many states of consciousness, which we ourselves still from time to time experience. The point is crucial, not only for the present discussion, but for any sound literary criticism or philosophy. And of course, Lewis was an Oxford professor of literature, and he also had a degree in philosophy. And so that's why it's important, because this basic ancient unity, which we no longer innocently hold, or actually there's three things. It's not just that we broke them apart. We both broke them apart, but in certain times we visit the archaic and experience the ancient unity. But we don't know that we're doing it, because in many ways our maps are smarter than we are. And so even as we take time to explore our maps, we bump into curiosities such as spiritual, material, and then school spirit. Well, school spirit is sort of that ancient mapping. Well, do I have a better understanding of what spirituality is? Yeah. From school spirit, that seems so secular. Yeah. It's going to have to be on both sides if you want to understand the division and how and why we separated it out. Now, in my looking at qualia soup, there's just a ton of self-forgetful wielding. And this is, of course, where Jonathan Peugeot shines. Because not only are we patterns seeing patterns, we are patterns trying to wield patterns. And to employ a little bit of postmodern cynicism and suspicion, why is it that we particleize all of this stuff so repeatedly? It's because we want to wield it. And the things that we can know by science are limited. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, consider a difficult relationship in your life. Consider that person. You're trying to wield them, aren't you? I'm just trying to understand them. Yeah, so you can wield them. I get it. Trust me. That's, as a pastor, you live with this because you would imagine people come to you looking for answers from the catechism. That's about 10 to 20% of what people come to me for, at least in real life church work. What do they mostly come to me to? To do what? To complain. To complain and to speak their anxieties. Why? Because the world is hard to wield. And you want to know the hardest thing to wield in this world? Other people. And part of the bargain with humanism is that the oldest way of wielding people was to kill them, because after you kill them, they conveniently go into the grave and shut up. That's why you kill people, because they're hard to wield. Once you have real laws and rules and norms and worldviews that say, I shouldn't really kill them, suddenly people are much harder to deal with because you can't kill them. We are patterns wielding patterns. And we've got the meaning crisis two-step, which is, well, the physical world is less substanceful than we imagined it to be. All this magical particle thinking. And you say, well, no, magical particles? No, it's magical thinking about particles. But we have more physical worldness to us than we like to admit. Now, we like to look for that physical worldness in others because we hope to wield them, but then when someone does the same thing on us, we're a little bit offended. No, I'm not subject to all of that psychology and sociology and all of that propaganda. Not me. Yeah, right. So, and in many ways, I think this is exactly what causes the meaning crisis. That we discover that, wow, the physicalness of the world is so weird that it kind of defies us. But there's a lot more physicalness in my mind than I thought. And so in many ways, this Cartesian substance dualism is going away. And that's not necessarily bad news for Christians. And, I find a lot of Christians being really anxious about people who don't believe in God, as if they're hard to come by, or they make bad neighbors. Now, I'm a Christian minister, and I'm really happy when people listen to my channel and they send me an email and they say, I'm going to church because of you. I celebrate that. I make no bones about my agenda here. I want to turn you all into Christians if I can. But I'm also a Calvinist, and it's so funny to listen to James Lindsay talk about that. And so, whereas much as I'd love to wield you and wield you into church, I can't, and I know I can't. Why? Because I've got this pesky theological upbringing that says it's the Holy Spirit that does that wielding. You, Vanderclay, are insufficient to wield others into the church and into their heavenly home. Where does that leave me? I think it leaves me basically Jesus saying, what did I tell you to do? You told me to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Yeah, start there. Okay. So stop trying to wield people. Maybe start trying to love them, because loving and wielding is not the same thing. And you know, the Christian house is plenty messy as it is. And the assumed implicit Cartesian dualist system is already breaking down and will likely continue to break down. Now, the difficulty is that makes people anxious because nobody likes being poked in their axiom. So I have only 6 minutes left. I got to keep this moving. Christian profession remains significant, but we all know the fudginess between professed belief and constant and consistent Christian consistent behavior. If we didn't, we wouldn't be yelling at Christian hypocrites, and you wouldn't have pastors preaching sermons and telling Christians to believe more. But all of this stuff is breaking down. And I don't think we should be pessimistic about it. I think some of this Cartesian dualism has led to a lot of kind of low resolution Christian picture thinking that leads to Sunday school answers that don't particularly map well onto the Bible and don't really map well onto people's lives. Now, that leads to a lot of messiness and some deconstruction, but I think also some reconstruction as we're seeing in this little corner of the internet. So I am now out of time, but I am glad I made this video. And if this video was helpful to you, leave a comment or subscribe. I've been watching a lot of YouTube lately, and you know, the first thing out of people's mouth is subscribe. Put on notifications. Support me on Patreon. And I always find that annoying, which is why I don't like talking about those kinds of things. But they are out there. And I don't know. So, yeah, and if you want to straighten out my philosophy, I'm sure there's plenty that needs straightening out. Go ahead. And it's just difficult to wield people, just like it's difficult to colonize them. So, hope I have more chance to make videos this week. I have one more conversation in the can that I'll release sometime this week, and it's a good one. It's a deeply meaningful one. And if the conversation with Brett Anderson kind of annoyed some of you professing Christians out there, you'll really like the next one. So anyway, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time, Lord willing.